Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Class 20. We're going to be talking about Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto and thinking about how their critique of capitalism requires us to think a little bit differently about distributive justice than a Rawlsian approach would. So today we're going to analyze the critique of capitalism and then think a little bit about how what justice means for Marx and Engels. So a little bit of background about our good friends Marx and Engels, whom you probably recognize with pictures like these, but at the time of the Communist Manifesto, they looked a little bit more like this. Marx was born in 1818 in Prussia, but he spent most of his life in London. He attended the University of Bonn in Germany, where he wanted to study philosophy and literature, but his father wanted him to study law. He was part of a drinking society, and when his grades began to slip, his father forced him to re-enroll in the University of Berlin so that he could keep a better eye on him. While continuing his legal studies in Berlin, he became fascinated by the philosophy of Hegel. And in the early 1840s, he completed his doctoral dissertation on the philosophies of nature and ancient Greek thought, and began working with some of the left Hegelians who wanted to apply Hegel's philosophy to more radical and left-wing causes. Now, Hegel famously thought that history followed a kind of rational purpose towards ever-increasing freedom, and developed the idea of this dialectical method, which many people think of as this thesis, antithesis, synthesis model. And the left Hegelians wanted to take this kind of progressivist view of history, but move it for more radical ends, rather than kind of confirming, like, for Hegel, this progressive view of history confirmed that we are the most rational society right now. But the left Hegelians, also known as the young Hegelians, wanted to push this further towards, like, well, how can we bring about the next phase of social evolution? He wasn't able to become an academic, so he went into journalism and eventually edited the Deutsche Französische Jahrbuche, a journal for radical writers and thinkers. He spent much of the 1840s and 1850s floating around Europe, writing for different outlets and participating in various radical social movements. His most famous collaborations are with Friedrich Engels, with whom Marx co-authored the Manifesto. He became involved with the International Workingmen's Association, the First International, in the 1860s, and began working on his master work, Kapital, which would be a contribution to political economy that criticizes the traditional political economists such as Adam Smith by demonstrating the unique dynamics of capitalism and its underlying contradictions as a mode of production. We won't be talking about capital too much today because we're interested more in his politics. He eventually died in 1883 after several years of illness and is buried in Highgate Cemetery in London. Marx lived through and commented on the tumultuous times of the 19th century, including the revolutions of 1848, the French coup of 1851, the Paris Commune, the American Civil War. Therefore, while Marx was well read in philosophy and political theory, we have to take seriously his commitment to understanding the empirical world around him. He famously wrote the 11th thesis on Feuerbach, which states, "Philosophers have hitherto tried to understand the world, but the real task of philosophy is to change the world." This point is even made explicit, that we have to kind of understand the world around us in order to achieve any of our radical goals, in the preface to the German edition of 1872 for the Manifesto, which states that the practical application of the principles will depend, as the Manifesto itself states, everywhere and all times on the historical conditions for the time being existing. So, what was happening around 1848, the same year of publication and of the Manifesto? Well, 1848 is also known as the Year of Revolutions, and this is a significant political event happening in Europe that has its origins in the French Revolution, which not only got rid of the absolute monarchy and feudal privilege in France and replaced them with first a republican government and then Bonaparte's empire, then the restoration of a Bourbon monarchy with a more liberal constitution. They also unleashed a series of wars, the Napoleonic Wars, throughout Europe. And as the First French Republic tried to defend the revolutionary government from the allies of the Ancien regime, And then Napoleon sought to expand the French Empire. Nearly all of Europe was embroiled in conflict that left millions of casualties following the French Revolution at the turn of the 19th century. Following the revolution, the Congress of Vienna between 1814 and 1815 brought an end to this warfare and reestablished the balance of power between the European great powers. France was returned to its natural boundaries and the Bourbon monarchy was restored. And key to this idea, to this treaty and this balance of Europe, was the Austrian Empire's foreign minister Metternich, who would later become the chancellor. And Metternich was a traditional conservative, and his goal was to maintain the balance of power in Europe, particularly by resisting Russian territorial ambitions in Central Europe and lands belonging to the Ottoman Empire. He was an opponent of liberalism. He maintained power with censorship and a wide range of secret police and spy networks. And he kind of was instrumental in maintaining a relative peace and balance of power, but was resistant to any attempts of kind of liberalizing reforms in Europe. France would then experience another revolution in July of 1830, which in response to King Charles X's attempt to reverse liberal reforms under the Charter of Government. The people of Paris built barricades in the streets for 3 days and forced the king's abdication and replaced him with the Duc d'Orléans, establishing a new monarchy in which the king would be the Duc d'Orléans would be the king of the French, not the king of France, in which the sovereignty flowed from the people. However, many felt betrayed by this revolution, as the July monarchy did not follow through on the Republican promises, and this created throughout France and throughout continental Europe a foment of dissatisfied liberals, Democrats, nationalists, and socialists. The liberals wanted to maintain constitutional monarchies, but ensure that there were civil rights and that the monarch was accountable to the people, or at least to wealthy citizens. Republicans and Democrats wanted to expand the suffrage to all men, or at least all land-owning men. Nationalists in Germany and Italy wanted the same level of unification that France achieved during the revolutionary and Napoleonic eras, as their states were still small principalities and fiefdoms loosely united. And socialists, in response to the growing industrialization of Europe, wanted not just greater political reform, but an answer to what was known as the social question. So they wanted not just political equality, but social and economic equality. And so into this powder keg eventually was ignited in the spring, or late winter and early spring of 1848, in which there were simultaneous revolutions that began in Sicily and Paris, and then quickly spread throughout all of Central Europe. Pretty much only Tsarist Russia, with its strong authoritarian control, and the United Kingdom, which had recently made some minor reforms on the social question, were unscathed. And liberal regimes were established against the old monarchies. And so you can see from this map, you can look more closely on the slides that I'll upload to Moodle, but you have this kind of spread of revolutions in, laser pointer, in Sicily and in Paris, and they kind of spread throughout the Austrian Empire. They lead to the demands of Hungary for independence from the Austrian Empire, attempts to unite all of Germany into one united Germany, which ultimately fail. Metternich is forced to leave. The King of Prussia is forced to abdicate. The King of France abdicates. Italy almost becomes united, but they end up failing. But the counter-revolutionary coalition was ultimately fairly weak. They were mostly united by their dislike of absolute monarchies, but there was little unity in between them. The socialists felt that the liberals had betrayed them, the liberals felt that the socialists were too radical, and they weren't able to effectively govern, and that meant that these revolutionaries were short-lived. And by 1851, in all of the revolutionary states, conservative monarchies were restored as counter-revolutionary forces were able to re-establish the old balance of power. Now, most reforms were curtailed. There were some limited liberal reforms, some freedom of the press, some expansion of the franchise in some states. But these set in motion long-term political dynamics that would be achieved by the end of the century, including German and Italian unification, freedom for the Russian serfs. Eventually, by in a couple of decades, the Third French Republic would be established. Austro-Hungary would be broken up, and Hungary would have its independence, and a series of labor reforms. So it's in this tumultuous period that the manifesto was written, and it was originally published in February of 1848. So right in the midst of this revolutionary fervor, it was originally commissioned by the Just Friends Society, which eventually renamed itself the Communist League, and this was a secret organization of radicals living in Paris. Marx and Engels had just joined the group and were tasked with drafting a statement of principles for the group. Engels wrote a first draft that took the form of a catechism, like a series of religious doctrines and beliefs, but wrote to Marx wanting to change the tone and format. Marx ultimately penned the final draft, as Engels said so, and it says in the preface to the 1883 German edition. And when he says that the main ideas of the manifesto, which we still associate with communism and Marxism, were Marx's alone. The manifesto, however, even though it was soon after the manifesto was published, Paris erupted in revolution, and the manifesto actually played no role directly in this. The French translation was not published in Paris until just before the working class June Days uprising was crushed. Its influence on the Europe-wide revolutions of 1848 was restricted to Germany. But it's still like, this is the context in which Marx was writing. So let's take a little bit closer look at the text itself. The text itself begins with one of the most famous phrases in the history of political thought, that a specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. All the powers of old Europe have entered into a holy alliance to exorcise this specter. Pope and Tsar, Metternich and Guizot, French radicals and German police spies. So all this conflict and disunity around 1848, they are all united against the communists. And so what the manifesto sets out to do, and it's important to think of this manifesto as both a political theoretical text, but also a rhetorical text, is to set out, as he writes, the following manifesto to publish their views, their aims, their tendencies, and to meet this nursery tale of the specter of communism with a manifesto of the party itself. So formally, the first kind of substantive claim of the manifesto is this articulation of what comes to be known as historical materialism. Here, Marx and Engels write that the history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of class struggles. Oppressor and oppressed stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on in an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight, a fight that each time ended, either in a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large or in the common ruin of the contending classes. Now, Marx and Engels are arguing here that the fundamental motor that drives history forward is this conflict between the oppressor and the oppressed. Or more formally, it's the conflict between who owns the means of production and who labors. And this fundamental division between those who own the means of production, those who own land, who own factories, who own raw materials, and those who labor, those who work the land, work in factories, mine these raw materials. This creates a fundamental class conflict that underpins all of society and either ends in the society collapsing or in a revolutionary reconstitution of society. And in other ratings, and it's hinted at in the manifesto, Marx and Engels kind of trace this history. They argue that in the ancient world, the division was between free citizens who could own property and slaves who could not. Eventually, the slave revolts and the reconstitution of the world into the feudal redivided it between nobles who owned land and serfs who did not own land but worked the land. Eventually, feudalism was overthrown in a series of liberal revolutions in England and in France and throughout Europe that overthrows the feudal order and creates the modern mode of capitalism, where it is no longer the owning of land that separates the noble from the serf, the owner from the worker, but it's the owner of capital, and it's not about the old feudal hierarchies and privileges of nobility were gotten rid of, and it's simply those who own capital, those who have money are the oppressor, and those who work for a living are the oppressed. And so Marx and Engels go on to write, and this is on page, I just forgot the page number on the slide. This is on page 475 to 476 of your reading. That this is a fundamental and huge revolution, that this puts an end to all feudal, patriarchal, idyllic relations, and it tears asunder, as they write, all feudal ties, that all of the kind of previously ways of organizing society that were grounded in these hierarchical relations between vassal and lord, between noble and peasant, are broken down, and the only relationship that we have to each other is this idea of naked self-interest here, and the cash payment, that we relate to each other purely in economic terms now under capitalism. Do you have money to pay for this or not? And so it has substituted, in one word, for exploitation veiled by religious and political illusions, it has substituted naked, shameless, direct, brutal exploitation. The bourgeoisie has stripped of its halo every occupation hitherto honored and looked upon with reverent awe. It has converted the physician, the lawyer, the priest, the poet, the man of science into its paid wage laborers. That you either, in capitalism, own capital and you pay workers, or you do not own capital and you receive a wage for hourly labor. That fundamentally, your life comes down to one of these two classes. You either pay other people to work for you, or you get paid in order to work for someone else. So how does this work? And Marx and Engels argue that capitalism transforms the mode of production from a kind of a more traditional market economy in which you create commodities, you build chairs, you raise you raise crops, you raise animals, you sell these commodities, the chair, the meat, the fur, the food, for money, and then you use that money to buy other commodities that you need to subsist. And this is going to be kind of you produce something, you sell that your extra that you do not need to survive, and you use that extra to buy other things that you want. And this is a very simple market economy. But this it's transformed under capitalism to this MCM model, where rather than starting with commodities, rather than starting with shares or sheep or corn, you start with money. And then you use that money, that capital, to buy labor, with which you then produce commodities. So you have a bunch of money, you hire people to do a job for you, they produce something for you, you sell those commodities at a profit, that is because you basically pay the laborers less than what you charge for the goods are, and that excess profit gives you more capital, and it allows you, and then this becomes a cycle that once that you are allowed to, you then kind of accumulate more capital, then you can hire more workers, produce more goods and commodities, sell them at more of a profit, and you can reinvest that, and this creates this cycle. So everything basically under capitalism becomes wage labor. Rather than laboring to make products that you sell, those without capital labor for a wage. And what Marx and Engels are basically saying is that instead of selling goods and services, you're selling part of your finite life, right? If you are paid by the hour, if you are paid whatever that wage is, you are not being paid based on for what the goods or services that you're producing directly. What you're actually being paid for is that you are selling 8 hours a day of your life to your employer, and they can basically tell you what to do with that time. That you are giving up your natural freedom and autonomy to your employer for 8 hours a day for enough money for you to survive. That you're selling your life to the highest bidder, but under capitalism, as we'll talk about in a second, this bidding always gets bidded. The price of your life always gets bidded down. So we'll talk about, and this ultimately leads in a transformation of the world. It creates a world market and a world culture. It increases global communication and urbanization. Population increases overall as well as become more dense. We have the tremendous explosion of industry, chemistry, and productive capacity that culminates in the domination of nature. And this revolution, Marx and Engels, in this first few pages of the Manifesto, are really kind of appreciative of, that they're respectful of what capitalism has accomplished, that like in no other political economic formulation has been able to transform the world, as they write, into its own image, but they are concerned with the costs of this, and we'll talk about those in just a second. But if you need to take a break, now would be a good time. Stretch your legs, pause this video, have a snack, and then we'll come back in just a second. Okay, so given this tremendous worldwide revolution that we just talked about here, why is capitalism bad? Marx and Engels make the argument that capitalism is fundamentally a structure of exploitation. They write on 478 to 479, In proportion as the bourgeoisie, i.e. capital, is developed in the same proportion as the proletariat, the modern working class developed, a class of laborers who live only so long as they find work, and who must work so long as their labor increases capital. What capitalism does is if you do not have capital, if you do not have independent money, your life is dependent on your ability to find a job and your ability that you will not live without being able to find a job, and you're only able to find job insofar as the labor that you provide is profitable to someone with capital, that someone is willing to pay you for your labor. And so these laborers who must sell themselves piecemeal are a commodity like every other article of commerce, and are consequently exposed to the vicissitudes of competition, to all the fluctuations of the market. That when labor becomes what you are selling, when you are selling your lifetime, not some good that you have produced, your lifetime, the price of your life, is subjected to all the market dynamics of supply and demand. And if the supply of what you are offering then is no longer in demand, the price goes down, and your lifetime becomes less valuable to the market. And so what Marx and Engels are talking about here is that capitalism is unjust not because of inequality, but capitalism is unjust because it transforms human beings into commodities. It forces us to sell off our life in order to survive, in order to eke out a meager existence. And this is where they talk about the idea of exploitation. And exploitation, in this Marxist understanding, is the extraction of surplus value from production from those who created the value. So the capitalist owns the raw material. They might own the factory or the mine or the land. They might own the raw inputs of production. It's ultimately labor power that transforms the raw material, transforms the wood into a chair, the raw iron into something usable, the wool into shirts, right? And that's what creates the extra value. Like Marx is kind of drawing on something similar to Locke's theory of labor here, that the labor theory of value, that the value in the goods is produced by the laborer, that workers create value. But that extra value, that surplus value that is created from labor, the capitalist then sells at a profit because they sell that for more good they sell that good for more money than they reimburse the labor. And with competition, mechanization, this drives down the cost of labor, right? If you need a job to survive, and you are competing against millions of other people who also need a job to survive, you're willing to accept any wage that's above starving, and maybe even below starving if there's no other choices. And so that drives down the cost of labor, so the capitalist pays you less. And with mechanization, you don't need to have the same type of specialized skills or training, that you are replaceable in an assembly line, and so your wages go down while your productivity increases. So capital gains more and more, extracts more and more of your excess profit, while paying you less and less. And so they write on 379 that the cost of production of a workman is restricted almost entirely to the means of subsistence that he requires for his maintenance and for the propagation of his race, but the price of a commodity, and therefore also of his labor, is equal to the cost of production. In proportion, therefore, as the repulsiveness of the work increases, the wage decreases. Nay, more, in proportion as the use of machinery and division of labor increases, and the same proportion the burden of toil also increases, whether by prolongation of working hours, by the increase of work exacted in a given time, or the increased speed of machinery. And so as we become more and more automated, more and more division of labor, more and more kind of an assembly line model, our labor is valued less and less, so we get paid worse, but even though we're producing more of a profit for our employers. The other line of critique is what Marx and Engels talk about as the alienation of the laborer. And they write on 469 that the work of the laborer has lost all. Sorry, that's 479, not 469. Has lost all individual character. He becomes the appendage of the machine. They are daily and hourly enslaved by the machine, the overlooker, and above all by the individual bourgeoisie or bourgeois manufacturer himself. That when we are selling off our life energy, our lifetime, and we are selling off our labor, we become alienated from ourselves and from our labor. That we no longer are free and autonomous. And this comes in a few different forms. On one hand, we become alienated from the product, the thing that we spend 8 hours doing, the chairs, the widgets, the cars, or the services that we provide if we are a doctor or a nurse or a teacher or a lawyer, are not ours. They don't belong to us. They belong to the capitalist, who gives us the raw materials and employs us to work. So we become alienated from the product of our labor. We also become alienated from the production itself. We aren't like, there's no creativity, there's no ownership, there's no kind of intentionality in a factory. That you are alienated from production because literally there's no aspect of you in the production. That you are that you are kind of following a monotonous task, and you are following the orders of someone else, and you have no choice over the matter, and so the production isn't really yours. But we also become alienated from our species being, Marx writes. Then this is alienation from our human essence. And this is the idea that we are selling ourselves to someone else, that we are selling our life energy and labor and our lifetime and hours to another person, and basically saying that you can control my life for this 8 hours a day. For 8 hours a day, my life belongs to you, and you can do whatever you want with it. And finally, we become alienated from others, that we're forced to compete with other people that we have a natural interest with, that we're forced to compete with other workers and other laborers in order to keep our jobs, and maximize profit for capital. And then we become alienated from those with whom from other human beings, especially those that we would have a natural affinity to, because we are both being oppressed. And so capitalism for Marx and Engels is what we could call a structural injustice. It's not a critique about individual wrongdoing in particular factories or particular capitalists, and it's not really about inequality or unfairness, but that there's a structural logic of capitalism that is exploitative, alienating, and unjust. That capitalism, it's not about intent, it's not about like good bosses and bad bosses. It's about that the structure of capitalism cannot be just for Marx and Engels because it necessarily exploits surplus value from workers, it alienates workers, and it results in an unjust system. That it's less about equality than a very robust meaning of freedom, of collective self-determination over the conditions of one's own existence. It's about a type of freedom that is not just political freedom, but social freedom too. And they close one of the sections of the Manifesto in 491. In place of the old bourgeois society with its classes and class antagonisms, we shall have an association in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. That we have collective freedom, not the freedom of private property, but that we are collectively able to determine as a community what type of work we're going to do, how much we're going to do it, and how we're going to be paid. That if we had collective ownership over the factory and we shared the profits to all people, that we'd be able to freely choose the life that we would live. Now, famously, Marx and Engels believe that capitalism is driven by this contradictory logic, that the weapons with which the bourgeoisie felled feudalism to the ground are now turned against the bourgeoisie itself. But not only has the bourgeoisie forged the weapons that bring death to itself, it has also called into existence the men who are to wield those weapons, the modern working class, the proletariat. And what he's saying is that by creating this class of workers, of uniting them in factories, of reducing them to a bare subsistence so that they have nothing left to lose in a society, they have no stake in the existing society, that eventually the logic of capitalism is going to drive the proletariats to a revolution. And they say that the proletarians cannot become masters of the productive forces of society except by abolishing their own previous mode of appropriation, and thereby also every other previous mode of appropriation. They have nothing of their own to secure and fortify. Their mission is to destroy all previous securities for and instances of individual property. That eventually the proletarian will become completely reduced to nothing, and they'll have no choice in order to survive but to overthrow the system of governments, to overthrow the system of economic exchange. And the revolution, Marx and Engels write, is an almost inevitable. The advance of industry, whose involuntary promoter is the bourgeoisie, replaces the isolation of the labor due to competition by the revolutionary combination due to association. The development of modern industry, therefore, cuts from under its feet the very foundation on which the bourgeoisie produces and appropriates products. What happens, right, if you keep lowering the cost of labor, if you keep lowering your wages that you're paying your employers, eventually you would, and producing more and more and more goods, eventually you run out of people who can afford to buy those goods, and the whole system collapses under itself. And so they conclude this section, what the bourgeoisie therefore produces above all are its own grave diggers. Its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable. So in section 2, and I'm not going to talk about this in very much detail, they articulate communism as the argument is the theory of communism as the abolition of private property. The communism is the theoretical arguments for the revolution, this revolution of the proletarians that will overthrow capitalism and private property. Now, throughout part 2, they engage a series of counter-arguments of objections to communism, from what happens to property, what happens to freedom, will this promote individual laziness, what about the family, what happens to the nation-state. I have religious reasons against communism, and they go through and they critique all of them, and I'm going to have you all in the discussion threads look at these in a bit more closely. But they close the manifesto with a series of proposals. These include the abolition of property and land and the application of all rents to public purposes, a heavy progressive or graduated income tax, the abolition of all rights of inheritance, the confiscation of all properties of immigrants and rebels, the centralization of credit in the hands of the states by means of a national bank with an exclusive monopoly, the centralization of the means of communication and transport in the hands of the state, the extension of factories and the instruments of production owned by the state, equal liability of all work, the establishment of industrial armies, the combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries, the gradual abolition of the distinction of town and country, free education for all in public schools, and the abolition of children's factory. So there are a series of concrete proposals of like what this abolition of private property is going to look like. And so you can think through like how revolutionary or not these principles are, but when we're comparing this to Rawls, this isn't calling for the redistribution of the benefits of social cooperation and competition, right? And such that it is a fair distribution of society's benefits. This is calling for a fundamental reorganization of society itself. That this is saying that we need to rearrange how we've organized society at a fundamental level. So this is a very, very different model. It's a very, very different model of justice, that justice requires a revolution. As they close the manifesto itself, communists everywhere support every revolutionary movement against the existing social and political order of things, and their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. Let the ruling classes tremble at the communistic revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Working men of all countries, unite. So this is a very, very different way of thinking about justice than we got from Rawls. Next week, we're going to shift our gears away from the question of justice explicitly and looking at the question of evil, responsibility, and politics, looking at Hannah Arendt's Eichmann and Jerusalem. And now I've condensed this reading. This was originally going to be over a course of 2 periods in the original syllabus, and so I've condensed this reading down to fit into 1 class period. So we won't be, unfortunately, be reading all of Eichmann and Jerusalem, but we are going to be reading some of the important parts. And so while you're reading this, think about what makes Eichmann evil, and how does Arendt distribute responsibility for the Holocaust? Now, for not the minute paper question, sorry, for the discussion thread for this evening, I want you to look closely at one of the objections to communism that Marx and Engels discuss in part 2. Describe the objection and Marx and Engels' response, and do you find this response persuasive? Why or why not? As a reminder, 200-word responses are due by the end of the week, by Friday at midnight, and then you have till Sunday at midnight to reply to one of your peers with a 100-word post. And so that is going to wrap things up for today on Marx and Engels, the Manifesto of the Communist Party. If you have any questions about the content, send me an email, drop by into office hours, or stop by into the discussion section. Also, if you have any questions or concerns about accessing the material or completing the assignments, let me know, and we can make fair and reasonable accommodations. Until next time, stay safe, stay healthy, wash your hands, stay away from people, do your part to help us all get through this together. All right, I'll see you next time.